40 years of hitting wood with a hammer, and look at him. Look at what he has to show for it. My father is a loser, and I've spent my whole adult life hoping nobody would connect our last names. My son said that into a microphone. Not across a kitchen table, not in the parking lot of some diner, where a man can absorb a thing like that in private. Into a microphone in the private dining room of a restaurant on King Street West in Toronto, with 40 people holding champagne flutes and a photographer from a business magazine crouched by the window, and me sitting at table 3 with a piece of halibut going cold in front of me. He'd just won something. Startup of the Year, emerging tech, some category with enough words in it that everyone in the room could feel important. He was holding the little glass award in his left hand and the microphone in his right, and he'd been going through the thank yous, and then he found me in the crowd. I saw him find me. He smiled the way you smile at a joke you're about to tell. Some of you know my stepfather, Rémi Lachance, he said, and he raised the glass award toward a table near the front. Rémi taught me what ambition looks like. Rémi taught me that a man's job is to build something that outlives him. A pause for the room to breathe. My biological father taught me how to sand a beam. The laughter came, not all of it, maybe half. But half a room laughing is louder than a whole room, because you can hear the exact silence of the people who aren't. I wish Rémi had been my father, Desmond said. I mean that. I've never said it out loud before. My son's wife, Astrid, laughed into her napkin and didn't try very hard to hide it. Rémi Lachance leaned back in his chair, and he found me across all that white linen, and he tipped his glass about half an inch. Not a toast. An acknowledgement. The way a man nods at a dog that has finally stopped barking. And Priscilla, my wife of 31 years, the woman I put through nursing school on a framer's wages, the woman who left me on a Tuesday in October 5 years ago with a suitcase and an explanation that lasted 11 minutes. Priscilla looked down at her plate and studied a smear of beurre blanc like it was going to tell her something. She didn't say a word, that was the part. Not the microphone. Not Rémi's glass. It was the top of her head, that gray-blonde crown I'd kissed maybe 10,000 times, angled down at a plate. I want to tell you what I felt because I think you're expecting rage, and I've been expecting to feel it too for months now, and it never came. What came was arithmetic. Because my son stood up there in a room he could not afford to be in a suit he had not paid for, having driven from a condominium he did not own, to a company where he was, in the strict legal sense, an employee, and he believed every single piece of it had come out of his own 2 hands. He didn't know that I had built it, all of it, quietly, deliberately, over 11 years, the way you build anything meant to stand. And he didn't know that I could take it apart. My name is Gordon Fenwick. I'm 68 years old. I've spent my life as a timber framer, which is a trade most people have never heard of, and everybody has seen. If you've ever stood inside an old barn in Prince Edward County, and looked up at those beams crossing overhead, held together with nothing but wooden pegs cut from dry oak, that's what I do. I restore them. I build new ones. I've raised frames from Kingston to Thunder Bay, and there's a church outside Perth with my joinery in the roof that will still be standing when everyone in this story is dust. I want to walk you through the 9 days that followed that dinner, and somewhere in there, I'd like you to ask yourself what you would have done sitting at table 3. But first I need to say something, and I need you to hear it properly, because if you don't, the rest of this is just a man getting even. I did not raise a monster. I raised a boy who was funny, who cried at the end of The Iron Giant, who at 6 years old wore my safety glasses to a barn raising near Yarker and fell asleep in the truck on the way home with sawdust in his eyelashes. I have a photograph of that day on the shelf above my bench. He's on my shoulders. The glasses are enormous on him. He is looking at the frame the way other kids look at fireworks. Somewhere between that boy and the man with the microphone, someone taught my son that a life is only worth what it can be photographed as. And I have spent a lot of nights trying to work out who. Here's what I've landed on. It wasn't only Priscilla, though she made a religion of appearances after she left. It wasn't only Rémi Lachance, though he was the priest of it. It was me. It was mostly me. I'll get to that. I owe you that. But I want you to have the facts first. The dinner was Rémi's idea, naturally. Rémi Lachance is a man who chooses restaurants the way other men choose weapons. The kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices, and a bottle of wine costs what I used to charge for a week of framing. I wore a navy suit I bought at a shop on Princess Street in 1997. Wool, properly cut, kept in a garment bag. It's a good suit. It doesn't shout. In that room, not shouting is the same as being naked. Desmond had been performing all evening before he ever touched the microphone. He was 34 years old and he sat the way Rémi sits. One arm hooked over the back of the chair, wine glass turning slowly by the stem, a little quarter smile he must have practiced somewhere. He told the table his Series A had been oversubscribed. He said the word oversubscribed twice. He said Bell Harbor Ventures had come to him, had chased him, had all but begged, and I sat there and ate halibut and knew exactly who owned Bell Harbor Ventures. I knew the numbered company that held it. I knew the name of the lawyer who'd filed the articles in Calgary. I knew that the retired professor who ran Bell Harbor's investment committee, a lovely courtly old man named Emmett Sarkeesian, who taught mechanical engineering for 30 years and now spends his winters in Sydney, BC, was sitting 4 tables over in a rented tuxedo, drinking soda water, doing me a favor he'd been doing me for 11 years. Halfway through the salad course, Dr. Sarkeesian caught my eye across the room and gave me a nod so small it barely happened. Desmond saw it. I know he saw it because his fork paused, and he glanced at me, and then he glanced at Sarkeesian, and I watched the question form and die behind his eyes in about a second and a half. Because a question like that costs something. To ask it, he'd have had to consider that his father might be a man worth nodding at. He went back to his story about the funding round. 9 days later, that half-second was the only rope he had, and he climbed it all the way down into the truth. But we're not there yet. Priscilla said our son was remarkable. She said it looking at Remy, not at me. He's remarkable, isn't he? The way she landed on isn't he made it a comparison rather than a question. Remarkable, unlike some. I said he certainly had energy. She heard exactly what she wanted to hear, which was nothing. Then Remy Lacoste leaned in with that voice he has, the one that comes from somewhere below the sternum and always sounds like a favor. And he told me that I was a fine craftsman. A real artisan, he said. And then he said what men like him always say, which is that there's a difference between a craftsman and a builder. A craftsman makes things beautifully for other people. A builder makes an empire. Desmond nodded along like he was hearing scripture in his own language. Remy Lachauss's empire, for the record, consists of a numbered consulting company registered to a mailbox in Montreal, a cottage on Lake Muskoka with a mortgage on it, and a leased Lexus. He has one client. I know this because I have seen every invoice. I didn't say any of that. I ate my fish. I thought about the drive home up the 401. The way the transport trucks throw slush at your windshield in February, and you can't see anything for 2 full seconds. And how you learn to just hold the wheel steady and wait. Then the award. Then the microphone. Then my son's mouth. When the laughter came, I set down my fork. I folded my napkin. Not neatly, I want to be honest, I just folded it. And I put it beside a plate of food I hadn't touched. I stood up. My chair didn't make a sound, because I'd been sitting on the edge of it for an hour like a man in a doctor's waiting room. I looked at Astrid, still laughing. I looked at Remy, glass still raised. I looked at Priscilla, who finally lifted her eyes and met mine, and gave me an expression I have thought about every day since, which was not shame and not apology, but a kind of tired irritation, as if I'd shown up somewhere without being invited. And I looked at my son. For a piece of a second, standing up there with the light on him, he looked frightened. There he was, the boy in the safety glasses, way down at the bottom of a well. Then it closed over. I walked out. Nobody followed me. Nobody called out. The door of that private room was heavy, and it swung shut behind me on a slow hydraulic hinge and made a sound like the last inch of a coffin. I didn't take a cab. It was the 2nd week of April, cold the way Toronto is cold in April, wet and mean, and I walked from King West all the way down to the lake and stood at the bottom of Bathurst looking at the water for a long time. Then I drove home, 3 hours on the 401 with the radio off. My house is on a concession road outside Wilton, half an hour north of Kingston. I designed the frame myself in 1988 and raised it with 11 friends over 2 weekends. And 4 of those men are dead now, and 1 is in a home in Napanee that smells like disinfectant and applesauce. It's a plain house. Post and beam, cedar siding gone silver, a wood stove, a Chesterfield my mother left me that Priscilla always hated. It's warm in January when the hydro goes out, because it was built by people who assumed the hydro would go out. I didn't turn on a lamp when I came in. I didn't pour a drink. I've watched anger drink, and anger with a drink in it makes decisions you have to live inside afterward. What I needed that night was to be colder than the ground in November. I went out to the shop. It's a separate building, 60 feet of it, and it smells like oak dust and linseed oil and the particular sweetness of ash. There's a jar on the bench with maybe 200 pegs in it. Trunnels, they're called. Riven oak, dried 2 years, tapered at one end. That's what holds a frame together, not nails. Not brackets, just those, driven through a mortise and tenon so that the joint pulls itself tighter with every year that passes. Here's the thing about a timber frame that almost nobody understands. If you want to take one down, you do not push it over. You do not swing a wrecking ball at it. You go up into it and you find the pegs, and you draw them out in the correct order, and the building comes apart into pieces that can be numbered and stacked and used again. I sat down on my stool in the dark and I looked at that jar of pegs for a long time, and I thought, I know where every one of them is, because I drove them. If you've ever had someone you love mistake your patience for a lack of options, If you've ever been called soft by a person standing on a floor you laid, then you already know exactly what that shop smelled like to me that night. I went inside and sat down at a desktop computer that is old enough to vote, and I opened an encrypted folder, and I typed a password that exists nowhere except in the back of my skull. The folder had 11 years in it. Now, I need you to stay with me for this part, because this is where you find out how badly all of them had misread the quiet man at table 3. 11 years ago, Desmond came to me with a business plan. He was 23, freshly finished at Queen's, and the plan was 38 pages of nonsense. Buzzwords stacked on top of projections stacked on top of hope. He wanted $800,000. He said it like he was doing me a favor, letting me in on the ground floor. Now I'd had a good career, better than anyone in my family ever knew, including Priscilla, because I don't talk about money, and because most of what I made didn't come from framing. It came from buying wrecked heritage buildings in towns nobody wanted in 1994, restoring them with my own hands, and holding on to them for 20 years while the country lost its mind about real estate. A shoe factory in Leslieville, 3 brick storefronts in Kingston, a grain elevator in Prescott I sold in 2011 for a number that made my accountant sit down. I had the $800,000. I could have written the check that afternoon. And I knew with total certainty that if I handed my son $800,000, he would spend 3 years burning it and the rest of his life explaining why it wasn't his fault. So I lied to him. I want that word on the table. I lied. I told Desmond my money was locked up in RRSPs and a couple of Gs and that I couldn't touch it. And I watched his face do that thing it did, the small collapse of respect, and he said, "Right, of course. Never mind, Dad." He called me risk-averse. Then he drove back to Toronto in a car I'd co-signed for. And then I went to see Yvette Boudreau. Yvette is a corporate lawyer in Toronto, 61 now, sharp as a chisel, and I've known her since she was articling and I was rebuilding the roof on her father's house in Cornwall for cost, because he was dying and she was broke. She has never once let me pay for lunch since. Together we built a structure, and I mean that word. We settled a discretionary family trust. The beneficiaries were Desmond and any children he might have, though the trustee had absolute discretion and the trustee was Yvette. We funded it with $2.4 million, which was most of what I had, over a period of years. The trust owned a numbered Alberta company. That numbered company owned another one. And that one, in 2015, capitalized a small venture fund with a very Canadian name and a very quiet website, Bell Harbor Ventures. We put a face on it. Emmett Sarkeesian, retired professor, a genuinely brilliant man who found the whole thing hilarious and who did it because he'd once been a young idiot too. He fielded the pitch. He asked the hard questions. He negotiated Desmond down, hard, so it wouldn't feel like charity, and then he wrote the check. My son flew home from that meeting so high I could hear it in his voice on the phone. Bell Harbor had found him. Bell Harbor had seen something. He never asked who owned Bell Harbor. Not once. In 11 years. And when Cadence Analytics finally had a cap table worth reading, this is what it said. 62% held by an institutional investor. 19% Desmond, founder and chief executive officer. The rest scattered across employees and a couple of angels I let in for the look of the thing. 62%. My son did not own his company. He was its highest paid employee, and the mysterious board he complained about at dinner parties. The board that never interfered, that always deferred to his judgment, that he described as hands-off, thank God, was a lawyer in Toronto and an old man in a shop outside Wilton. Then there was the vehicle. 2 years ago, Desmond decided a chief executive could not be seen arriving at meetings in a 5-year-old Audi. He wanted a Range Rover. His personal credit was thin. He'd never carried a balance he paid off himself in his life. So he put it through the company as a fleet lease with an outfit called Cataraqui Fleet Services. Cataraqui Fleet Services is me. It has a logo. It has a phone number that rings through to a very polite woman named Denise in Kingston, who has worked for me for 22 years. He signed 9 pages of that lease without reading one of them. The clause that mattered was on page 6, paragraph 4. The vehicle is provided in connection with the executive's active employment, and the lessor may recover it on the cessation of that employment. He signed with a flourish. He photographed the keys and the condo. This is the one that still bothers me, and it bothers me because it was never really about Desmond. After Priscilla left, she got very interested in where people live. She'd call our son and describe Ramey's cottage. She'd talk about neighborhoods the way some women talk about grandchildren. And within 2 years, Desmond and Astrid were hunting for something that would make their friends go quiet when they walked in. They found it in a converted 1890s shoe factory in Leslieville. Brick and beam. Original Douglas fir posts 12 inches square that some idiot in the 70s had painted white, and that I stripped by hand in 1996 with a heat gun and a cabinet scraper. I have owned that building for 29 years. Desmond phoned me and asked, delicately, whether I might help with the deposit. And I told him no. I told him a man shouldn't live in a place that eats him. He hung up and told Astrid I was cheap. And then the property manager for that building, who works for me, who has worked for me since she was 24, reached out to Desmond, entirely unsolicited, and explained that ownership was looking to place a high-profile professional tenant in the penthouse unit as part of a repositioning strategy, and that they were prepared to offer terms substantially below market. The occupancy agreement he signed was tied, in its fourth clause, to his continued employment with a qualifying corporation. He bragged about that deal for a year and a half. He told people the landlord had practically begged him. He said the words repositioning strategy at Thanksgiving like he'd invented them. He never read the fourth clause. Nobody ever does. Not once in 40 years of contracts have I met a man in a hurry who read clause 4. So there it was, laid out on a screen in a dark house at 2 in the morning, 3 hours north of the room where my son had just told 40 people. He wished another man had fathered him. The company, mine. The vehicle, mine. The home, mine. The floor he stood on to say it, mine. He had nothing. He had never had anything. He had been living inside a frame I built, and he thought the frame was weather. I called Yvette at 8 the next morning. I said 4 words. Pull the pegs, Yvette. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Gordon, come to Toronto, not the phone. I drove down that afternoon. Her office is on the 29th floor, and it has a view of the lake. And when I walked in, she didn't shake my hand. She handed me a mug of black coffee she'd poured the second the elevator chimed, because she knows how I take it when I mean it. And then she sat down across from me, not behind the desk, in the other chair. And she said something I did not want to hear. She said, before we do a single thing, I want you to sit there and hear me say this out loud, because in 20 years no one else is ever going to say it to you. I said, all right. She said, you made him. I looked out at the lake. You gave a 23-year-old a company and let him believe he'd earned it. You gave him a car and let him believe he'd earned it. You gave him a home in your own building and let him think a stranger admired him. Gordon, for 11 years you handed that boy the feeling of accomplishment with none of the substance, and then you sat back and waited to be thanked for it. He didn't build a fraud. You did. He's just the man living in it. There was a long silence in that office. I know, I said. And I did. I'd known for years, the way you know about a soft spot in a sill plate. You feel the give under your boot and you tell yourself you'll get to it. Here's the truth I'd been hiding from behind all that clever paperwork. I was not being generous. I was being a coward. Money was the only thing I could give my son without having to sit across from him and be known. Every dollar was a substitute for a hard conversation I never had. I let him think the world had discovered him because it was easier than telling him the world hadn't, and that I loved him anyway, and that he'd have to go earn the rest himself. Love without truth in it is just a very expensive way of hiding. Yvette let me sit with that. Then she said, so, now that you know whose fault it is, what do you want to do? And I told her I wanted to teach the only lesson I had left, and that I was going to teach it in the only language he'd ever learned from me, which was money, and God help us both. She asked whether I wanted it done all at once. Freeze everything Monday morning. Car, accounts, condo, 1 letter, 1 hammer blow. I said no. I told her about the frame. I told her you don't wreck a building you love. You go up into the bents, and you find the pegs, and you draw them one at a time in order, and you lower each timber down and you set it on the grass. It takes days. It's exhausting. Every timber comes down separately so it can be seen. I don't want to bury him, I said. I want him standing on the ground when there's nothing over his head. That's all. Just once, standing on the ground, in the weather, like everybody else. Yvette wrote for a while. And then she said the second thing I didn't want to hear, and it's the reason I'm telling you this instead of some fantasy. You can't put him on the street, she said. This is Ontario. He's a residential occupant. Employment clause or not, if he doesn't leave voluntarily, you file with the landlord and tenant board and you wait 8 months and a member with a caseload from hell looks at you like you're a slumlord. Don't imagine you can throw your son out in 72 hours. That's not a country, that's a movie. So we did it the slow, real, boring, legal way, which is the way everything actually happens in this country. And it took 9 days to change my son's life, and then it took the board another 5 months to finish the sentence, and by then he'd already left. Because a man doesn't stay in a house once he knows who's holding the pegs. Here's what we planned, sitting in that office with the lake going gray behind her. Monday, the vehicle. Thursday, the signing authority, the corporate cards, and the audit. And with them quietly the $22,000 that left Cadence Analytics on the first business day of every month and landed in a Montreal mailbox belonging to Lachen Strategic Advisory. The following Tuesday, the letter about the condo hand-delivered, with a second envelope inside it that I'll tell you about when we get there. 3 timbers, down and down and down. And in between nothing. Silence. Which is the cruelest part of any demolition if you want to know. Not the pulling. The waiting between pulls. I drove home Thursday night and spent the weekend cleaning the shop and splitting a face cord of maple, and I want to be clear that I felt no pleasure at all. I felt like a man who's discovered rot in a beam his own father cut, and has to take the wall out to reach it. And knows the whole time that the reason it rotted is that somebody a long while back didn't flash the window properly. My son spent that weekend, I found out later, telling people he'd finally set a boundary. He said his old man was probably sulking in the woods. He told Astrid I'd come around by the long weekend the way I always did. He phoned Rémi Lachance for approval, and Rémi poured it over him like syrup, and told him that some men are simply of a different generation. That you can't teach a carpenter to see a horizon. And my son said, this is a direct quote. Astrid gave it to me later, crying, in a Tim Hortons on Coxwell. My son said, it's good to finally have a real father figure. Rémi Lachance, whose entire adult life at that moment was a single line item on a company I owned. Monday morning, Desmond came down to the parking level under the shoe factory at 7:40, in a suit that cost more than my first truck. There was a flatbed in the loading bay with its yellow lights turning. A woman in a high-vis vest was crouched at the rear tire of the Range Rover, chalking it. Desmond told her she was in his spot. She stood up, unhurried, the way people who move other people's property for a living stand up. And she said she wasn't in his spot, she was here for the vehicle. He laughed. He actually laughed. He told her it was a corporate lease, that she had the wrong car, that this was a Cadence Analytics vehicle. She turned her clipboard around and showed him the recovery order with his plate on it. Issued by Cataraqui Fleet Services, a name he had signed 9 pages of documents with, and had never once bothered to look up. He phoned the number on the order. Denise answered on the second ring in Kingston. She was polite. She was extraordinarily polite. She confirmed that the lease had been terminated at 12:01 that morning by the lessor, as was the lessor's right under paragraph 4 on page 6, and that no further action was available to him, and was there anything else she could help him with today. My son stood in a concrete parking garage in Leslieville, in a $4,000 suit, and watched the front wheels of his identity lift off the ground. The winch whined. The truck pulled out into the rain on Eastern Avenue, and then there was an empty rectangle of dry concrete with a little oil stain in the middle of it, and a smell of diesel and his own breath. That was one peg. He didn't call me. He was furious, and being furious felt like strength, and men who feel strong don't make phone calls. For 3 days nothing happened, and I want you to understand what those 3 days did to him, because they were the design. He went into the office. He told his COO it was a paperwork mix-up. He rode the streetcar and told everyone it was because of his carbon footprint. He rebooked a meeting in Mississauga twice. He almost got his balance back. Thursday morning he stopped at the coffee place in the lobby of his own building, the way he did every morning, and he ordered for 6 people, and he handed over the black corporate card, and the machine said "Dedeklinged." The barista tried it again. There were 9 people in line behind him. He knew 4 of them. He went upstairs and logged into the company's banking portal. His control panel, the one he'd shown his mother on a laptop at Christmas, and it told him access had been suspended. He typed it again slowly the way we all do, as though the machine had simply misheard us, suspended. Then the email arrived, from a firm on Bay Street he'd never heard of, on behalf of the holder of 62% of the shares of Cadence Analytics Inc., advising him that all executive signing authority, corporate credit, and discretionary spending had been suspended effective immediately pending a full operational and financial review, and that the shareholder would be in touch regarding the composition of the board. The shareholder. He'd said that word for 11 years the way you say the weather. Something distant, benign, generous, uninterested. The shareholder had just taken his hands off the wheel of the only thing he'd ever loved. And at 11:20 that same morning, his phone rang and it was Rémi Lachance. But it wasn't the voice. It wasn't the sternum voice, the one that dispensed wisdom about horizons. It was thin and it was going up at the ends. And it was saying that the 22,000 hadn't landed. That it always landed on the first business day. That it had landed on the first business day for 6 years. And where was it? And Desmond had to fix it. Right now, today. Because there was a payment due on the cottage and a payment due on Priscilla's car. And the club had already sent a second notice. I have thought a great deal about what went through my son's mind in the next 10 seconds. Because Desmond is not a stupid man. He was never stupid. He was only ever told. 22,000 a month, he'd have thought. From my company, to Rémi. Rémi has never had another client. And then, all the way at the bottom of it, that half second at the awards dinner. An old man in a rented tuxedo, nodding across a room at a timber framer in a 1997 suit. He hung up on Rémi Lachance without answering him. That's the detail Astrid told me. He just took the phone away from his ear and set it down while the man was still talking. Here's what I hope you take from this part, because it's the part I didn't understand until I was 68 years old and had already wrecked something. Rémi Lachance was never a winner. He never was. He was a man performing a life he could not afford, and the entire performance was funded, invisibly, by the very man he spent his evenings pitying. Take the money away, and there's nothing under it but a frightened person in a good coat. The loudest man in the room is almost always the one with the least holding him up, and the quiet one at table 3? Ask yourself why he's so calm. Sometimes it's weakness, and sometimes he built the room. The next Tuesday at 10 in the morning, a courier delivered an envelope to the penthouse of a converted shoe factory in Leslieville. Astrid opened it, because Desmond hadn't come home the night before. Inside was a formal notice from the numbered company that owns the building, terminating the occupancy agreement in accordance with Clause 4, setting out the process, the timelines, the board, the whole grinding machinery of it. 60 days, then a hearing, then more months. All of it correct, all of it legal, all of it slow, and every page of it saying the same thing. This was never yours. And inside that envelope was a second envelope unsealed. In it was a certified check for $4,200 made out to Desmond, which is first and last month's rent, on a one-bedroom in Scarborough near the Warden Station. And a note in my handwriting which said, "This is not a gift. It's the last thing I owe you." Dad, Astrid called him. And an hour later my son's truck, a rented one, a U-Haul cargo van, because that's what you drive when your Range Rover is on a flatbed, pulled into my yard outside Wilton. Now slow down with me here, because this is the moment the whole 9 days was built to arrive at. And I've gone over it in my head so many times I could tell you what the light was doing. I didn't go to the door. I was in the shop, and I let him knock on the house and then find his way across the yard through the mud. And the door of the shop was open because it was warm for April, and the light was coming in long and gold across the bench. He stood in the doorway. His tie was gone. His shirt was untucked on one side. He looked like a man who has been awake for a very long time in rooms he no longer trusted. And he looked around my shop. Really looked at it, maybe for the first time in 20 years. The pegs in the jar, the chisels in the rack sharpened, oiled, the frame drawings pinned to the wall, 20 years of them, some for buildings that outlived their owners. I don't think he was seeing a hobby room. I think he was finally seeing what it was, which was an office, which was for 11 years the head office of everything he'd ever had. "How could you?" he said. His voice cracked in the middle of it. "How could you do this? To me, to your own son? Everything I built, I could have laughed. God forgive me, some ugly part of me wanted to. But this wasn't the night for laughing. I pointed at the stool across the bench from me. I said, 'Sit down, Desmond.' The yelling's finished. Now you listen." And there must have been something in my voice because he sat. I turned my laptop around and one at a time I showed him. The Trust, the Alberta Company, the Second Alberta Company, Bell Harbor Ventures. Emmett Sarkeesian's engagement letter dated 11 years ago, 1 page, 4 paragraphs, signed G. Fenwick at the bottom. "You don't own Cadence," I said. "You never did. You own 19%, and you have the title, and you are the highest paid employee in a company controlled by a man you called a loser into a microphone." He said no, just that, twice, no, I built it. I didn't argue with him. I've learned that you never argue with a man in the moment the floor goes. You just show him the next page. The Cataraqui Fleet Services lease, page 6, paragraph 4. You never earned that truck. You were permitted to drive it. The permission ended. The deed to the shoe factory in my name, 1996. There was no repositioning strategy, son. There was no landlord who admired you. There was your father, who owns the building, who let you live in the best unit in it for a number that wouldn't cover the taxes, and who never told you because he was a coward. I watched the blood go out of his face. "But that's not the keystone," I said, and he looked up, because on some level he already knew. I opened one more folder and I turned the screen, and there it was. A consulting agreement between Cadence Analytics Inc. and Lachance Strategic Advisory Inc., $22,000 a month. 6 years of invoices. 6 years of one-line descriptions, strategic advisory services as discussed. "Did you ever wonder," I said, and I said it quietly, because as quiet as what makes a thing land, why Rémi never mentioned his other clients? He was already shaking his head, small, fast, like a man trying to shake water out of his ear. He hasn't got any. He has never had any. That $22,000 a month is his entire income. Your company is his only client. And your company is funded from the first dollar to the last by me. I let it sit there in the sawdust and the gold light. Your mother left me for a man on my payroll, I said. She just didn't know it. Neither did he. Neither did you. Desmond made a sound. It wasn't a word. He put both hands flat on my bench, on the oak, and lowered his head between his shoulders like something had come down across the back of his neck. The cottage in Muskoka. Priscilla's Lexus, the club membership, the man who lectured him about horizons. Every single one of them, financed through my son, out of my trust, from a shop that smelled like linseed oil. He wasn't the player. He wasn't even a piece on the board. He was the board. And I sat there and watched my child understand it, and there was no triumph in me. None. I want to be very clear about that because I know what channel you're watching and I know what you came for. There was nothing in that room but two men and a mistake that had taken 34 years to finish being made. "Dad," he said, into the bench. "Why?" And I told him the only true thing I have. I said, because it was easier. Because I could write a check in 4 seconds and it would have taken me 4 hours to tell you the truth. Because your mother told you a man is what he can show. And instead of arguing with her, I just quietly gave you more things to show. Money handed over without the truth attached isn't a gift, Desmond. It's a cage with the door painted like a window. And I built it. Me, not Remy, not your mother. He looked up. "You want to know who ruined you?" I said. "I'm sitting right here. You've been calling him a loser for years. You had the wrong reason, but you had the right man." Then I closed the laptop, and it made that soft click, and I stood up, because my hip was aching and because I was almost done. "Here's what happens now," I said. "You're going to get a job, not a title, a job. I don't care if it's driving a forklift in a warehouse in Etobicoke. You're going to pay rent with money that came out of your own hands. You're going to find out who you are on a Tuesday afternoon when nobody's watching, because that's the only place anybody actually is." He asked me, and I could hear how much it cost him to ask. Whether there was anything left. Whether I'd set something aside. Whether there'd be, someday, some kind of. And this is the part I've had letters about, and I'll tell you exactly what I said. "There's an envelope in Yvette Boudreau's safe," I said. "It has your name on it. You'll find out what's in it the day after I'm buried, and not 1 day sooner. And Desmond, if you still need whatever's in that envelope by the time I'm dead, then I've failed you twice, and there's nothing more I can do about it from where I'll be." He stood there for a while. Then he went out across the mud to the U-Haul, and I heard it turn around in the gravel and go. And I sat back down on my stool and picked up a chisel and a stone and started sharpening it, because my hands needed something, and there was nothing else in the building to hold. The days after that were the quietest of my adult life. No emergencies. No 11 p.m. phone calls beginning with "Dad, quick question." No manufactured crises that only money could solve. Just the sound of a house that was built properly, ticking as it cools. And on the 5th evening, sitting out back with a mug of tea and the peepers going in the swamp beyond the fence line, my phone rang, and it was Priscilla. I answered and I said nothing. It came out of her in one long unbroken current. Remy was finished. The consulting income was gone, and there was nothing underneath it, nothing. 30 years of nothing. The bank had started on the cottage. The Lexus was going back. The club had suspended them and everyone knew. And it was my doing, all of it, because I was jealous, because I'd always been small, because I'd waited 5 years to punish her and finally found a way. She asked me how I could be so cruel to a woman I once loved. She did not ask about our son. Not once. 31 years, 1 child, and she got all the way to the end of that phone call without saying his name. And I felt the last thread of whatever had still tied me to that woman just let go. No snap, nothing dramatic. It was like watching a peg come free in your fingers when you thought it would fight you. I let her run down. I listened to the frogs. There was a bat working the yard back and forth over the garden. And when she finally stopped, I said, "Priscilla, Remy Lachance isn't a line item on anything of mine anymore. Neither are you." Then I hung up, and I put the phone on the arm of the chair, and I sat there in the dark for another hour while the tea went cold, and I did not feel like a winner. I felt like a man who had finally finished a job 40 years too late. That was in April. In October, I had to go into Whitby to pick up a load of white oak from a mill I've used for 30 years, and on the way back I stopped at a Tim Hortons off Thixon Road, because that's what you do. There was a framing crew in there. 6 of them, in the dust and the tape and the knee pads, at that hour of the afternoon when a crew comes in for the last coffee before they lose the light, and one of them was my son. He'd lost about 20 pounds. His hands were wrapped, the tape you use before you have the calluses, the tape that means you're new. He was laughing at something a big kid with a beard was saying, and he was carrying a tray of double-doubles back to the table for men who did not know his name a year ago and did not care what it was. I stood by the door with my keys in my hand for a long time. I didn't go over. I want to tell you I did. I've replayed it. I've built 100 versions of it in my head where I cross that floor and he stands up and it's the end of a movie. But he was carrying a tray of coffees to a table of men who'd worked beside him all day, and he was carrying it right, and nobody in that room was watching him. And I have learned at 68 years old that the very worst thing I ever did to my son was make sure somebody was always watching. So I went out to the truck and I drove home with the oak in the back, and it was almost dark by the time I hit the turnoff, and I got the wood stove going, and I sat. I built things all my life that were meant to stand for 200 years. Bents and braces and roofs, and every one of them held because of joints you cannot see from the outside. The only frame I ever raised that mattered, I built out of money and silence, and it came down in 9 days. But he was carrying that tray right. That's what I've got. Some nights it's not enough. Most nights, lately, it is. So before you go, tell me where you land on this, because I honestly want to know, and I read every single one. Comment 1 if you think I did the right thing, that some lessons can only be paid for, and that I finally sent my son the bill. Comment 2 if you think I went too far. That a father who takes back a man's car, his company, and his home in 9 days is not teaching, he's collecting. Or comment 3 if you think what a lot of people have already told me, which is that I was the villain of this story from the first check. That I built the man, and then I punished him for being exactly what I built. And tell me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. Somebody in Yellowknife told me last month it was 19 below, and she'd watched the whole thing with the wood stove going. And I sat here in Wilton and thought, well, there's 2 of us then. Have you ever been written off by somebody who had no idea what you were actually holding up? Tell me, I'll be here. And if this one got under your skin, stay with us. We tell stories about quiet people all the time. The ones everybody underestimates, right up until the day they stop. Thank you for staying to the end. This is a work of fiction, inspired by real emotional experiences and fully reimagined in Ontario, Canada. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental.